Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
He is best known for his massive bestseller, The Rule of Four, that remained on the New York Times bestseller list for 49 weeks. Now, 10 years later, he has published a new work, The Fifth Gospel. It is also on the New York Times list. It's set in the Vatican and concerns two brother priests, one Latin Rite, one Eastern. To discuss the new book and what he discovered along the way is author Ian Caldwell. Ian, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you. Let's start with your last work. Yes. You and Dustin Thomason collaborated on the Rule of Four. Mm-hmm. It took you 10 years from that time to now. Is it harder to work alone?
It is harder, I'll tell you this. One thing, we had to learn how to write together, and then I had to unlearn what we learned and learn how to write alone. Fortunately, the nice thing is we've been friends since we were in third grade, and in the course of the decade it took to write this novel, there were some ups and downs, and he was always there for me during the downs. So the friendship has always been there, even though we're not writing together anymore.
10 years? Why did it take so long, Ian?
I'll tell you this, if I had known that it was going to take 10 years, I probably wouldn't have done it. But what the challenge at the beginning was, people had written Vatican thrillers before, and I didn't want to write another thriller like those.
Right.
Authors would get to a certain point and meet that famous Vatican wall of secrecy, or they just wouldn't really try that hard. And at that point, they'd start to fictionalize.
Yeah.
They would make the story up. And the challenge that I posed was, what would happen if we dug deeper? What would happen if we got through that wall, talked to priests, talked to bishops, talked to cardinals even, researched what it's really like to live inside the Vatican and for a mystery to evolve naturally from the life of inside the Vatican.
This is an intricately told tale. It has many levels. There might be a few people who look in and they see a title like The Fifth Gospel and go, what is this? Tell them the basic setup of this book. It's really a whodunit and almost a spiritual thriller.
It is. It's certainly a spiritual thriller. Much more time is invested in the novel in getting to know the faith of the main character than you'd see in any mainstream
Yeah, this is not
thriller.
Dan Brown. Let me just say it.
Thank you. Well, to address here, I'll tell you about the setup, and then I'll tell you a bit about why it's called The Fifth Gospel. The premise is that two brothers grew up inside the Vatican. Many people don't know that this is possible, but there are children. There are about 24 children of Vatican employees who grow up entirely inside Vatican walls. And these are, in this fictional world, two of them. They are the sons of an Eastern Rite priest and a Latin Rite mother, so they are they imbue both traditions.
Right.
And the older brother, Simon, grows up to be a Latin Rite, a Western Catholic priest, and the younger brother, who is the protagonist, Alex, becomes a Greek Catholic priest. So within the same family, we have both traditions, and in the Eastern tradition, married men can become priests. So in fact, the protagonist is a married priest with a son, raising his son in the Vatican when something very unexpected happens that embroils the family in a spiritual crisis, really.
Yeah.
It's a perilous situation, but also a spiritual crisis.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating whodunit. I don't want to give away too much. What drew you to the Vatican? You are not Catholic.
I am not Catholic, and in fact, I was very nervous about this because I knew that to do this novel right, I was going to have to build contacts inside the Catholic Church and move my way up the ladder to the point where I could call a bishop or for instance, the rector of the Pontifical North American Seminary.
Right.
And I had none of these contacts to begin with. I think the allure of it was partly that it's such a mysterious and famous ancient place, and also the challenge of
that's why it took you 10 years. Just to get them on the phone takes about 2 years. I know.
Yes, it is not easy.
But you never went to the Vatican. I was stunned after reading this. I thought, my, you must have spent months there writing up diagrams, taking pictures. You never visited.
I couldn't, and I wish I could have. I wish I could have taken 6 to 12 months off and headed to Rome and done the research myself. But the reality was, just as I started writing this book, I got married, and my wife and I had our first son 9 months later, another son 2 years after that, a third son 3 years later. So throughout this decade, we had little kids in diapers. I couldn't just take off for months to Rome. I think if I'd done that, my wife would have said, "Don't bother coming back."
Yeah, stay there.
Right, and so instead, it pushed me into doing library research and phone research, a lot of interviews with clergy, and I ended up buying about 600 books on the Vatican, some of which were recommended by those priests I interviewed.
How has this changed you, this experience, and has it altered the way you see the Catholic Church, its traditions, and the arcana around you at all times?
It has certainly changed it. I grew up in a sort of secular environment. We were a Protestant family for a while. I ended up going to a magnet school for science and technology. And in our culture today, at a public school where science and technology have such an emphasis, there's a story that goes along with science these days, which is that religion is what we used to have as a set of answers to difficult questions, and now that has been replaced by a more effective set of answers provided by science and technology. I came out of that as, at best, an agnostic and probably pushing the atheist line. But in college, I started to study Western civilization, and I realized how deep the Christian tradition was and how many of our most famous Western thinkers spent most of their lives dealing with thinking about Christian topics. And the one who fascinated me the most was St. Augustine. For about a semester in my junior year of college, I studied St. Augustine. And one of the stories that, of course, St. Augustine is most famous for is that as a young man, he had a Christian mother who was trying to encourage him to become more Christian. And he, as a budding intellectual, said, I've read the Bible, and there are things about it that contradict each other or that don't make sense to me, and I reject this. But later in his life, he traveled across from northern Africa up to Europe. He trained with St. Ambrose, and St. Ambrose said, wait a second, you're misunderstanding the Bible. You're reading it too literally. Let me show you the right way to read it. And of course, from this, we have St. Augustine, the titanic intellectual of Christian history. And I thought, there's something hypnotic about that story to me. I think even after I left that behind, that voice was in my head, and that's one of the things I returned to when I wrote this novel. I wanted to learn how Catholic priests are taught to read the Bible.
Yeah, and this is sort of central to the plot.
It is.
How one Tell me about the Dia Tesseron. I'm mispronouncing it. How do you pronounce it?
Actually, I've heard priests pronounce it both ways. I've heard Dia Tesseron and I've heard Dia Tesseron. So I will say Dia Tesseron. You can say it however you like.
You say Dia, I say Dia. Tell me about, what is the Dia Tesseron?
So one of the conundrums that Christians have always had to address is we have 4 Gospels telling one story, the story of Jesus Christ's ministry, his life on earth. And yet, in most cases, 3 of them tell the story very similarly. Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the story very, very similarly. And then John tells it very differently. And Christians from the beginning have had 2 big questions. One is, why is John so different? And the other is, if we believe in one God and one truth, why do we have 4 versions of the same story? So early on, in the middle of the 100s AD, a Christian intellectual in an ancient Christian capital called Edessa decided, well, what if I just take those 4 Gospels and I weave them together into a single Gospel?
Right.
This is the so-called 5th Gospel that the title refers to. This was not a far-out, unorthodox text. It was used by the Christian church in Syria for centuries before the bishops in that area decided, we're going to go back to having 4 different Gospels. And when they did that, they burned all the copies of this ancient text. So it's very, very rare now.
And that is very central to this plot, as is the Shroud of Turin.
Yes, the Shroud, which you've covered in a recent segment of this show, is a fascinating topic because to this day, when it's exposed to the public, more people go to see the Shroud of Turin than visit any museum exhibit on Earth.
Wow.
And yet, there's a huge divide between people who still believe that it's an authentic relic and those who are convinced that science disproved it during the radiocarbon dating of 1988.
Right.
So one of the things I wanted to get into in the novel was, does the Bible have anything to say about the Shroud? Now, most of us are familiar with the Gospel account of what happened to Jesus, the marks of the crucifixion and the Passion, the account of his burial, and the rediscovery of the empty tomb with the shroud inside it. So there's nothing there on the face of it that would suggest to us that we can learn something new about whether the Shroud is authentic or not, whether the Bible has something new to say. But what I found was when I interviewed priests and asked them how they were trained to read the Bible in seminary, they said, you know what, we are taught that when 2 different accounts are different, when 2 gospel writers, 2 evangelists tell the same story in a different way, and they can't quite be reconciled, there are ways to figure out which one is probably the literal fact and which one might be a symbolic or theological approach to the same story. If you learn that technique of reading the Gospels, then something very interesting happens when you reread those passages about the Passion and the burial of Jesus, because there's one single detail that's very, very revealing about the Shroud of Turin.
Thanks for that tease, which you're not going to reveal now.
I will not reveal it here.
Tell me about the writing process. I mean, as a writer, I look at this. This is such an intricate plot. You've got multi-subplots going at the same time. You know, the central being these two brothers and one charged with a murder, the other, you know, trying to help him. But so much is revealed. Did you do a lot of outlining? How extensive?
An immense amount of outlining. In fact, I convinced myself that I'd done so much that I had finally cracked this story and I knew how to write it, and I went ahead and wrote it and discovered that it was a mess. So I had to backtrack and I had to pare it down. There was actually probably another 50% of this novel that has disappeared because it was just too complex. And what's left, I think, is this very streamlined, page-turning novel that does cover a bunch of topics. It covers important issues in John Paul's papacy, for instance, his outreach to the Orthodox Church. It talks about the Shroud of Turin. And the topic, as I mentioned, that interests me the most is the way that Catholic priests are taught in seminary to read the Gospels, because to me that's fascinating. It's and that comes through. I mean, I have to tell you, when I first got this and I thought, the fifth Gospel, you know, my alarm bells went off. I have to say, after reading it, it's respectful. There are liberties naturally taken. That's the prerogative of a fiction writer. But it is very true to what's happening and what the Vatican is. And, you know, your imagination certainly comes in. I was impressed at how you sort of kept yourself in the guardrails that you set up early on. You don't allow yourself to sort of go down brown land and Thank you.
Go crazy.
That was very important in writing the novel. I wanted to come out with a book that I could hand to someone who lives and works inside the Vatican and have them say, you got it right, you got the facts right, and you got the spirit of this place right. One of the most rewarding things that's happened to me is one of the first priests I contacted is an ex-seminary dean of an Eastern Catholic seminary in Pittsburgh, and he taught me a lot about what training is like for priests and the Eastern Catholic tradition. But the most important thing that he gave me was a little shot of confidence at the end, because I came back years later and said, here's what I did with all of the information you gave me. Here's the book I wrote. Will you be a fact checker for me? And he came back and said, I will. And then when he read the book, he said, I've got to tell you something. When I gave you all of that information at first, I did it because you were a nice guy, and I thought you meant well, but I wasn't sure what you were going to do with it or how good this book was really going to be. And I have to tell you, I think this is the best depiction of the inner life of a priest that I have ever seen in fiction. Wow. And that melted me. To have that, that's exactly the kind of response from exactly the kind of audience that I'd been looking for.
Has it deepened your faith at all?
It certainly has. It's very touching to see how many good people, men and women within the church, have dedicated their lives to Christian truths, expanding them, and especially in the field of biblical scholarship, fearlessly pursuing answers by putting a sacred text and in front of them and being willing to say, maybe this is true, maybe this is a spiritual truth that isn't necessarily literally true, and being able to be very, very careful with such a delicate thing, such a holy thing as a sacred text. The honesty and the lifelong dedication that it takes to do that is very inspiring to me. So I've certainly been nudged in the direction of a much greater respect for Catholicism.
Ian Caldwell, thank you so much. The book is The Fifth Gospel. It is available at bookstores everywhere and online, and it's a great page-turner. Even if you're not interested in religion or any of these topics, it really has a narrative dynamo that is impressive.